Starmer and Macron are completely clueless. Their countries are declining at an accelerating rate. There's no economic growth, there's no social progress, there's just decay and decline. The pressure for radical change is mounting in both countries. I'm Allister Heath, and once again I am responding to some of the excellent reader comments on my latest article about how Macron and Starmer are competing to destroy their respective countries as quickly as possible. We begin this week with a question from Martin. So Martin writes, "Civil war is coming to both France and Britain, but this is a civil war that we have never had to fight before between competing ideologies imported from outside. In that regard, it is not really a civil war, but a war against an invading force that our politicians let in." Now, Martin, I don't entirely agree, right? I do think there's a major problem with Islamism, and of course that problem was indeed imported. But I think it's oversimplified to limit it to that. What's happening really here is that you have hard left forces all across Europe and even America that are growing in influence and growing in power. And they pose just as much of a threat to Western values as the Islamists. You also have the parallel rise of woke ideology, and woke ideology again rejects capitalism, rejects free speech, rejects democracy, rejects Western values. So I think the internal challenges are grave, but I don't think it's simply a case of imported Islamists. I think imported Islamists are a major threat, and we need to redouble our efforts against them. We need to take that threat much more seriously than we have in recent years in both France and Britain. But that is only part of the issue. I also think that Macron and Starmer, their main failures are simply ideological. They don't really believe in free markets. They don't really believe in reform. Macron pretended that he did and trying to reform, for example, the French pension system, but he's now given up to try and save his skin, to save his new old prime minister. So I think it's all about ideology. I think it's partly about imported ideology, but it's also about homegrown ideology. I don't think we can simply blame immigration for that. That would be a terrible mistake, and that would be very unfair. The next question is from David Bone. So David writes, "After the 400 billion Sunak and Johnson unsuccessfully spent on COVID, Labour have come in without a stable economy and war chest the Tories historically always leave for them. There's no money, but they're spending it anyway because it's all they know how to do. The wrong government at the wrong time. The maths is pretty clear. This can't end well." Yes, well, I think that's quite a good way of putting it, but I think it's even worse than that. While the Tories hadn't left a war chest effectively for Labour to spend, they had left a budget and a bunch of fiscal and spending predictions that were actually tolerable. Jeremy Hunt had pushed through a number of spending cuts, at least in the years ahead, and the fiscal arithmetic wasn't completely disastrous, at least in the short run. In the long run it was disastrous because of pensions and the NHS. But Labour could and should have kept the Tory spending plans going, and then it wouldn't have needed to put up taxes the way it did. But the problem is Labour wasn't interested. They thought they could just snap their fingers and the economy would bounce back, that growth would come in automatically, that they'd have lots of money to spend. Anyway, they went crazy and they massively increased public spending. They then had to put up taxes in a huge crippling manner, and now they're going to have to do it all over again. They are fiscally profligate, they don't control the public finances, they don't understand the need to make economies, they are out of control, frankly, and this government is going to end in disaster like all Labour governments always do, spending money they don't have. The next question is from Jane Mitchell. Jane says, "As a population, we've been completely backed into a corner by both the mainstream parties during subsequent terms in office. Everyone knows reform doesn't have the answers to it all, but as a nation and democracy, we've been left with absolutely no other alternative. We either vote reform or we will be reformed in the most undemocratic way possible without our consent." So that's a very interesting point, and it all boils down to, if we're going to have another government on the right, a right-wing government, who will lead it? Will it be reform or will it be the Tories? And that, I think, is the big question for conservative-minded voters. I've always supported the Conservatives, and I hope Kemi Badenoch is able to bounce back and recover. At the same time, Nigel Farage is leading massively in the polls, and Farage has a big challenge now, which is he needs to keep building his party, keep adding intellectual ballasts, keep recruiting high-profile people. Reform is no longer a one-man band, but it needs at least 20 or maybe even 30 senior people to join it or to appear somehow, so that it can plan a proper means of reforming Britain if and when it wins the next election. The next right-wing government will have very little time to reform the state if it wins the election. The only way all the reforms can be pushed through, the restoration of Britain, the undoing of the Blairite constitution, the taming of the civil service, the massive economic reforms that are required, the deregulation, the withdrawal from international treaties, the end of net zero, the end of the Equality Acts, all that stuff. Well, the only way you're going to achieve that is if you seize control of the machinery of state on day one after a general election. And that requires deft planning, very detailed planning. It requires having a lot of personnel lined up. It requires a day-by-day plan. It requires the greatest planning and the most radical agenda that this country has seen since maybe 1945. So for reform to be able to do that, it will need a lot more human capital. It's clearly moving that direction, but it has a long way to go. And as to the Conservative Party, clearly their policies are much better than they used to be, but their main problem is most of the public doesn't want to hear from them. Most of the public feel betrayed by the Tories, by their incompetence during their 14 years in office, and hence the reason why they are pretty low in the polls. The next question is from Simon Rogers. He says, it seems Canada and Australia are being forced into the same self-destructive playbook as well. Just think what it would be like in the US if Trump hadn't got in. Yes, I mean, the problem is technocratic social democracy is a new normal across the West. It is a default ideology. It is this combination of higher and higher taxes, public spending, central planning, regulate everything that moves, woke policies, very high levels of immigration without sufficient integration or sufficient checks on who actually comes in, what their ideologies and so on. So you've got this sort of mess of a policy, mess of an orthodox policy which is being implemented across the West. And you have to be very brave or very different if you want to break that mould. But that is where the public is going. The public is demanding change. And even Macron pretended to be a populist to win office. He exuded change and populist vibes, but in fact ended up governing exactly like the centrist dad that he truly was. So that is where we stand. We've got a public that demands massive change. They voted for Trump in the US, and Trump is delivering huge change. He's an agent of disruption. He is changing very important policies, and he's achieving results in some important respects. For example, his staggering breakthrough in the Middle East over the past few days. Meanwhile, Starmer and Macron are completely clueless. Their countries are declining at an accelerating rate. There's no economic growth, there's no social progress, there's just decay and decline. And the pressure for radical change is mounting in both countries, as I write in my piece. I suspect that there'll be serious change in both Britain and France in the next 2 to 3 years. The next question is from someone calling himself Big Fish. Why don't we have safeguards to prevent these people from destroying our countries? Well, the safeguard is democracy, right? Every few years we vote and we need to choose someone to govern our country. The problem in Britain is that the Conservative Party was completely discredited after 14 years of almost complete failure, and Reform was too nascent a party with insufficient personnel, high-level personnel backing it, which meant that most people, or a minority of people, but more than any other group, chose to vote Labour. Keir Starmer was elected with a massive majority as a result of the way the first past the post rewards winners, but with a very small percentage of the vote, only about a third of those who voted, and this came at the same time as there was a big decline in voter turnout. The next election will be completely different, because the public trusted the Tories and been betrayed, the public trusted Labour and feels betrayed again. The next election is going to be very different, where the choice will also include Reform, the Greens, the Corbynites and so on, and you're going to see a disintegration of the voting shares of the two main parties. Democracy is the only viable system. It's the best possible system, but it requires voters to actually vote, to actually turn out, and to actually put their ballots where their mouths are. Now we have a question from Frederick James Pickles. He writes, it's time a tax was applied to people from overseas living here for use of utilities, schools and the NHS. This would be on top of taxes already being paid, no pay, no stay. Well, okay, to a certain degree we have that. People have to pay something for the NHS, but that's not really the point here. I think we need to be more radical than that. I think immigration has to be for a purpose. So you shouldn't pay welfare benefits to migrants. If you come here, it should be to work, and you should be able to earn enough money to not depend on the welfare state. Other countries like the UAE implement this kind of system. We need to move to that kind of system. Secondly, we should force people who come here to take up private healthcare insurance. They should effectively have private insurance to use the NHS or to use the private system. Again, that's fair, and that's the case in other countries such as America, or again the UAE and other countries with a better, more sensible immigration policy than us. So it's not so much about tax, it's that the welfare state needs radical reform, and far too many UK citizens are abusing the welfare state, or being lazy, or being paid not to work. That's a catastrophe. But we should not add to that catastrophe an idea that the British welfare state is actually the welfare state of first resort for the rest of the world. That's also totally wrong. So we should start by stopping that, but we should also simultaneously reform the welfare state for UK residents and citizens. We shouldn't try and only blame immigrants for our problems. That's totally wrong. There's a problem with too many immigrants on welfare, but there's a massive problem with too many British people on welfare. It's crippling our economy, destroying our industry, and will probably lead to blackouts over the next 2 or 3 years if we're not very, very careful. These are the sorts of issues that need to be discussed today. You know, one of the big challenges for a new right-wing government will be constitutional reform, undoing the Blairite takeover, ensuring that Parliament is once again powerful, ensuring that the judges don't legislate, merely interpret the law that is passed by Parliament, those sorts of issues. And so yes, we need a Thatcher-style leader, somebody with her determination and her principles and her beliefs and her communication skills, but we also need someone for the modern era rather than any kind of reheated policies of the past. Some excellent points to debate, yet that is all we have time for this week. Thank you to all our subscribers for your comments. Keep them coming, and as always, we will try and respond to as many of you as possible.